South Africa, which has a very high violent crime rate. Murders are like a very common occurrence in South Africa. The Van Breda family, which lived in Stellenbosch, South Africa, hopefully I said that right, consisted of the father, Martin Van Breda, who was 54 years old when our case takes place, which is in 2015. His wife, Teresa, who was 55 years old, and their children, Rudy, who was 22, 20-year-old Henry, and 16-year-old Marley. The Van Breda family was very well off. Martin was the director of 15 companies, and he owned the Australian subsidiary of International Property Group, Engel and Volkers. He also developed a private school in Pretoria and founded a company that tracks and recovers stolen vehicles. So, they are extremely wealthy, and they moved around quite a bit as well. They lived in Melbourne for a while. They owned a $2.2 million home in Butterham, Australia. Teresa and Martin made sure that their children had the best of everything. They went to only top schools and lived a very luxurious life. While the family was living in yet another multi-million-dollar home in Perth, the oldest son, Rudy, moved out. He moved to Melbourne, where he attended a master's program at the University of Melbourne. 2 years later, Henry kind of followed in his brother's footsteps and moved to Melbourne to study physics. So, the family lived in Australia for a while, but then they moved back to South Africa in January of 2014. Well, the older boys stayed in Australia to continue their education, but Teresa and Martin moved back, taking Marley with them because she was still a teenager. I guess this move was spurred by Teresa wanting to live closer to her family, but also Martin had a ton of business in South Africa, so they moved back. They moved into a luxury home in this gated community, which was in the Golf Estate in Stellenbosch, and this was an absolutely gorgeous area. It was called the Solid Golf Course, and it had a golf course, but also a vineyard and a restaurant, all on the estate or in the estate. I read online that their estate was valued at $17 million US. And this was one of the safest places to live in South Africa. The only way you could get into or out of this gated community was with an access card, and the gates were 10 feet high. They were electric. the summer. Rudy fell asleep quickly. Henry stayed up on his laptop for a while. And then, in the early morning hours of January 27th, around 1 a.m., he was still awake. He was trying to sleep, but he couldn't. He, laid in bed for a while. He listened to some music, and then around 2:30 a.m., he got up to go to the bathroom, and he was, sitting in the bathroom, playing on his phone in the middle of the night. Everyone had been asleep for hours, so the house was quiet, dead silent, when all of a sudden, from the bathroom, he could hear some loud noises. And it was like loud banging sounds coming from inside the home. So Rudy leaves the bathroom to go investigate, and he's following the noise, which is taking him directly to his own bedroom. He's really scared. He's super confused, and as he gets closer, he sees this shadowy figure standing between his bed and Rudy's. And this was a person covered head to toe, no part of him was showing. He was wearing a mask that only had little circles cut out for the eyes. And this man was attacking Rudy in his sleep. Henry freaks out. He doesn't know what to do, but he is watching someone violently attack his brother. So he just begins to scream. And suddenly, Martin appears, and he flips on the light to the boy's bedroom. And he, places his body between the masked man and his son, who is being attacked, trying to stop the attack. It wasn't until this point, when Martin turned on the light, that Henry saw that the attacker was using an axe, and he was hitting Rudy's head. Once Martin tried to get, in between them, the attacker turned and began driving the axe into Martin's back, over and over. Martin dropped to the floor and stopped moving, and Rudy wasn't moving either. The attacker continued hitting Martin with the axe over and over, even though he was on the ground, not moving at all. And if that isn't horrifying enough, the attacker was laughing hysterically while he was doing this. Henry was frozen with fear at this point. He was so scared that he literally could not move his body. He was frozen. He just watched in horror as his mom, Teresa, came running into the room, then kind of right back out, and he heard the attack begin on his mom. I guess Henry was out of the attacker's line of vision, but then, when he had finished whatever he had done to his mother, he turned around and began slowly approaching Henry. As as he got closer, he lifted his axe like he was going to start swinging at him. And Henry lifted one arm to block the axe and used his other to wrestle the axe away from the attacker. Henry would later say he was astonished at how easy it was to get the axe away. This man had just brutally attacked his entire family, and then he just kind of grabbed it and took it away from him. Then Henry shoved him really hard. And then Rudy, who was lying on the bed, began making these gurgling noises. And Henry turned to look at his brother, and the attacker took this moment to pull out a knife, and a struggle between the attacker and Henry ensued, and the attacker was using the knife to slash at Henry's chest. He stabbed him in his left arm, and then the attacker pushed himself up and stabbed Henry deeply in the chest. According to Henry, the knife was lodged in his side so deeply that the attacker was struggling to get it back out. And while he was concentrating on getting this knife out, Henry swung the axe down and made contact with the attacker's shoulder. This was his shoulder of the hand that was holding the knife. So when he hit it with the axe, he dropped the knife and the attacker ran out of the room. And Henry began to chase him out of the room. The attacker began running down the stairs, and Henry began chasing him through the home. And as he was chasing him down the stairs, he picked up the axe and threw it, trying to throw it at the man. And then he tripped on the stairs. He jumped up as quickly as he could and tried to continue his chase. He said he noticed the side door of the house was open, but he didn't see if the attacker had gone out the door. So the attacker doesn't seem to be in the house anymore at this point, and Henry is in full-on shock. He gets his cell phone and he calls his girlfriend in Australia. Then he Googles the number for emergency services, but he doesn't call it. He goes back upstairs and he notices that Marley is moving her arms and her legs just a little bit. This is the last thing he remembers before he loses consciousness. When Henry comes to, 2 hours had passed. He said he woke up super confused, and then he went looking for his phone. He Googled the number for emergency services again at 7:12 a.m. He then uses the family landline to call emergency services. His first words were, quote, "My family and I were attacked by a guy with an axe," end quote. So I'm not sure if the emergency services, dispatchers in South Africa, aren't really trained she put him on hold like 3 times for over 5 minutes each time. And this poor kid is injured. He's just gone through major trauma, and he's being placed on hold. I can't even imagine how you put someone in that situation on hold. So I guess the problem was that the family lived in a gated community, so the address wasn't showing up on Google Maps. Without an address, like without an address that popped up on the maps, I guess, the system wouldn't let her send emergency services to the home because it wasn't considered a legitimate address. So then Henry gets on Google Maps and finds an address close to the gated community to give them. This 911 call lasted for 25 minutes, with them putting him on hold several times. And after 25 minutes, emergency responders, first responders, were finally dispatched to the home. When first responders arrived, they described the scene as being total chaos, with blood everywhere. One of the first paramedics on the scene said that it was one of the worst scenes he had ever seen in his 40 years on the job, which is pretty bad in South Africa, where there is a ton of violent crime happening like every day. When first responders arrived on scene, Henry was wearing shorts, like basketball shorts, and white socks, and they were covered in blood. Marley had been stabbed, or, I don't know, not stabbed, slashed with the axe 5 times in the head alone. Her jugular had been severed, and she had multiple other injuries. They rushed her to the hospital, and they were able to stabilize her. They put guards at the door of her hospital room because no one had any idea who had done this. Henry was treated at the hospital for his injuries. He gave a statement to the police, and he was discharged. He went to stay with family as he recovered, but his injuries weren't super life-threatening. Martin, Teresa, and Rudy were all pronounced dead at the scene, leaving Henry and Marley the only surviving family members and the only witnesses of the attack. On February 5th, 2015, Martin, Teresa, and Rudy were laid to rest. Marley was still in the hospital when the funeral service took place, but Henry did attend. And once the funeral was over, the focus shifted from the brutal this gang. And police didn't have a lot of evidence to use because they didn't really find any evidence inside the home. There weren't fingerprints or shoe prints of anyone who didn't belong in the home. Like, all of the shoe prints and fingerprints belonged to the family members. And this lack of evidence gets more suspicious because the killer, whoever had attacked the family, didn't even bring his own weapon with him. The axe and the knife belonged to the family. So who would come in and kill an entire family, because that was the only thing that happened, and not bring their own weapon? And how did this person know where to find an axe? Like, you wouldn't have an axe just laying around inside your home. A neighbor came forward and said that she heard raised voices that were like yelling coming from the home around 10:30 p.m. But this was hours before the attack began, so the timeline doesn't add up. The clothes that Henry was wearing were taken as evidence, and they were tested, and all of the blood on them, like on the socks, it was like a blood spatter. It all belonged to the members of his family, which meant he had been standing very close to them when the attacks happened. It didn't take police long at all to begin to suspect Henry. In June of 2016, the state decided to bring charges against Henry, and they gave Henry's lawyer the heads up that these charges were coming. And his lawyer decided it would be better if he turned himself in rather than wait and be arrested. So he was being charged with 3 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of tampering with a crime scene. According to the state, Henry had given police false information, and it had been determined that his injuries were self-inflicted. They also established a timeline for that night based on some evidence on Henry's phone. At 4:24 a.m., he called his girlfriend who lives in Australia. Then at 7:12 a.m., he starts Googling emergency services numbers. What was super strange about this is that on the kitchen fridge, there was a list of emergency services numbers. So then at 7:15, he finally places the call to emergency services. When he got off the phone from that call, he called his girlfriend again, says, quote, "They're all unconscious and bleeding from the head. Hee." End quote. So head over there after this to listen to it for yourself and let me know if you think he's laughing. To me, it sounds like he's saying hee, but he says he was saying please. The media was doing some investigating of their own, and soon they began to report that Henry had an addiction to tick, which is what they call meth in South Africa. The Times tracked down a man who claimed to have been Henry's drug dealer. He reportedly identified him from a photograph, saying that he had been a regular customer. Henry allegedly spent some time at an upmarket drug rehab in Cape Town as well. Henry's lawyer read a statement of his version of events from the night of the murders. And what the prosecution noticed right away was that what was being presented to the court was a very different version of what Henry had told police. Some of the things that were different were, like he had told police the attacker was completely covered head to toe, except for his eyes, and he never mentioned knowing a race or being able to identify a race. But in court, he said it was a black man. He also told police there had only been one attacker. But in court, his lawyer claimed he also heard angry voices coming from downstairs. Another difference was the timeline. He said when he was on the phone with emergency services that he was smoking cigarettes. This was something that was super weird to people because his family had just been killed. He knows his sister is still alive upstairs, and instead of being up there with her, he's in the kitchen smoking. After the initial plea hearing, the state began to lay out their case. And the first thing they did was to show that no one could have gotten into the home, and that there was no evidence that anyone except the Van Breda family members had ever been inside the home that night. They told the court that you could only get into and out of the estate with an access card, unless someone had climbed the 10 feet fences that surrounded the estate. But this was an electric fence, so you would have gotten shocked over and over and over. And if they did happen to do that, they would have had to do it without being spotted by the round-the-clock security guards and the 360-degree cameras that recorded 24/7. The security manager took the stand to testify that no one had breached the security the night of the murder. Forensic experts came in and testified that there were no footprints, bloody footprints or fingerprints, hair fibers, unknown DNA, nothing to suggest that an unknown person had been in the home that night. his clothes was from his mom and sister, as well as his brother and dad, so he had to have been standing right next to them. Then they brought in an expert who showed that his wounds had been superficial and had been self-inflicted. There was also evidence at the scene that something bloody had been rinsed or washed off in the shower. In October, against the wishes of his defense team, Henry took the stand in his own defense. He repeated his story perfectly, like he had quoted it word for word. While he was on the stand, recounting the events that led to the brutal murder of his mother, brother, and dad, he was completely emotionless. He claimed that the inconsistency in his story was because he had been in shock during his first statement, and he also said that the police had transcribed it incorrectly. While he was on the stand, the prosecution asked him why he didn't call emergency services for 3 hours after the attacks had happened. They also asked why he was Googling emergency services numbers when they were very clearly posted in the kitchen. And the more questions that Henry answered, the more his story began to fall apart. On May 21st, 2018, the court found Henry guilty on 3 counts of murder, on 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of defeating ends. And on 1 count of defeating the ends of justice. He was immediately taken into custody instead of temporary release until his sentencing. In the interest of the society, instead of letting him go until sentencing, he was transferred to Pollsmoor Prison's hospital section, and he was under treatment for epilepsy and depression following the murders. On June 7th, 2018, Henry was sentenced to 3 life terms for the murder of his parents and brother, and another 15 years for the attempted murder of Marley, and then 12 months for the obstruction of justice charge. He was moved to the Drinkenstein Correctional Center to serve out his term. The prison is famous for being the location that Nelson Mandela spent the last part of his life, or his imprisonment. Henry attempted to appeal his conviction in November of 2018. His girlfriend Danielle spoke to 60